Treason is not the reason for the season. Episode 11, Regulating Categories of Weapons. Or, if Congress can't ban bump stocks, then Congress can't ban tactical nukes. When Congress, or a state, considers regulating some category of weapon and prohibiting it from possession by civilians, such as assault weapons, bump stocks, or large-capacity magazines, Militia-As-Terrorism Extremists shout shall not be infringed and insist that the Second Amendment promises everyone access to all weapons, and they argue that any limitation against any category of weapon violates the Second Amendment. That is not how any of this works. The Constitution's militia clauses include the following. Article 1, Section 8. Congress shall have power to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively, the appointment of the officers, and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. The Second Amendment states, a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, shall not be infringed. Militia-As-Terrorism Extremists argue that the Second Amendment mentions a right to bear arms tied to militia service, and so they argue they should have unlimited access to full military firepower. But what they forget is that the right to bear arms that shall not be infringed is a right to bear arms registered to a state militia, regulated by Congress, subservient to the President, and subject to court-martial for disobeying orders. And they forget one little word in the Constitution, arming. Congress shall have power to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia. From the same article and section, Congress shall have power to raise and support armies, to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces. The Constitution gives Congress the power to decide whether the military will fly the F-35 Lightning. And that same section of the Constitution also gives Congress the power to decide whether the militia will be armed with an 18-gauge musket. Congress has the power to arm the militia. Congress decides what weapon systems the Army fields, not the generals, not the privates. Congress decides what weapons the militia fields, not the militia members, not the privates. And in the Militia Act of 1792, Congress decided that every member of the militia would be armed with a single 18-gauge musket, 24-shot, and a quarter pound of gunpowder. So, when some Billy, Bob, hayseed, tries to invoke the Second Amendment to say he has a right to a machine gun, a rocket launcher, and a basket of hand grenades, that's like a private in the Army telling Congress that he is planning on driving the M1 Abrams tank home and park it in his garage. What weapons are used by the Army and the militia is decided by Congress. Not the privates. Not the generals. Congress. The Second Amendment shall not be infringed does not override Congress's power to arm militias. When the Militia Act of 1792 was passed, it mandated that militia members possess a single 18-gauge musket, 24-shot, and a quarter pound of powder. If a member of the militia were activated and sent to war, might that militia member need more than 24 rounds of ammunition? Certainly, but they were expected to be supplied ammunition by Congress. Might that militia member find usefulness to carry more weapons, such as a pistol that was ready to fire? Certainly, but it was Congress's authority to decide what weapons to arm them with. Might that militia member find usefulness in having some artillery pieces to provide indirect fire support? Absolutely, and again, it is within Congress's authority to decline arming the militia with such heavy weapons. In the Militia Act of 1792, why would Congress limit militia members to a single musket, 24-shot, and a quarter pound of gunpowder? For one, because Congress did not want the militia to be so well armed that individual members had enough arms and ammunition to revolt all on their own. One of the most alarming moments of Shays' Rebellion was when Shays and 1,500 men attacked the Federal Armory in Springfield, Massachusetts, to capture muskets, shot, and gunpowder there, so as to arm their rebellion. When Congress set such a low limit on how much powder a militia member had, it limited how long individual militia members could fight a rebellion before running out of ammunition. 24 rounds would be enough to train with, and enough to deal with an initial call to combat. After that, it would be up to Congress to supply more shot and powder to the militias so they could keep fighting. During the Revolutionary War, it might take 100 or more musket shots, on average, per enemy killed. Arming each individual militia member with 24 shot and powder, would be enough for them to train loading and shooting a musket in militia drills, and would be enough for them to form up with the rest of the militia to fight an enemy. But a single militia member, with only 24 shot, would be unable to inflict much damage were they to commit treason or commit terrorism. It is within Congress's power as spelled out in the Constitution's militia clauses, to limit the arms that civilian militia members can possess. The militia clauses in the Constitution allow Congress to establish a minimum set of arms for militia service. In 1792, this was a single musket and 24 shot per militia member. All states must allow the minimum arms mandated by Congress expected for militia service. And it is within Congress's power as spelled out in the Constitution's Commerce Clause to also establish a maximum set of arms that can be possessed by civilians. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Congress shall have power, to regulate commerce, among the several states. The National Firearms Act of 1934 establishes several maximums for weapons that are heavily regulated. This includes machine guns, any rifle over 50 caliber, hand grenades, suppressors, Molotov cocktails, sawed-off shotguns, and short-barrel rifles. In between the minimum arms required for militia service and the maximum arms allowed by Congress, is a set of weapons that are left to the states to allow or not allow. States must allow the minimum arms required by Congress for militia service. This is mandated by the Second Amendment. But states are not required to allow a single gun or bullet beyond this minimum. And states cannot allow anything prohibited at the federal level via the Commerce Clause. One issue that has arisen in modern times is that there is no Militia Act currently in effect. The U.S. abandoned using the militia in any active way when it switched over to the National Guard system around World War I. Without a Militia Act in effect, there is no law that establishes exactly what arms are expected for militia service. As a result, interpretation of the law has slowly expanded the arms allowed for militia service, and therefore the arms protected by the Second Amendment, to be any long gun, up to 50 caliber, any feed mechanism including semi-automatic and bump stocks, any size magazine and even belt-fed, with no limit to the number of firearms or amount of ammunition owned by a single person. So, in 1792, the Militia Act established a very specific list of arms required for militia service: a single 18-gauge musket, 24 shot, quarter pound of gunpowder. All other arms were left to the states to regulate as they saw fit. In 1916, the National Defense Act created the National Guard and the active use of militias essentially ended. While the National Guard is a dual federal/state entity, state defense forces cannot become federal entities. Then in 1934, the National Firearms Act established a federal maximum for arms allowed for civilian possession. Machine guns, anything over 50 caliber, hand grenades, and so on, were heavily regulated. The federal assault weapons ban was passed in 1994. It lowered the maximum allowed firearms and banned firearms that met its definition for assault weapons. It expired after 10 years. But as of today, there is no specific minimum arms required for militia service, and so what used to be the minimum required for militia service, the minimum that was protected by the Second Amendment, that minimum has slowly expanded to include all long guns up to any weapon not regulated by the National Firearms Act. Militia-As-Terrorism Extremists have even come up with their own category of weapon they believe is protected by the Second Amendment. Their argument is that the Second Amendment protects a right to keep and bear arms, and so, Militia-As-Terrorism Extremists argue that any weapon that a single person can carry, any weapon they can bear, is protected by the Second Amendment. But again, this ignores the Constitution granting Congress power for organizing, disciplining, governing, and specifically for arming the militia. The Second Amendment does not grant militia members the right to keep and bear whatever arms, of whatever kind, in whatever quantity, that the militia members choose. It protects the right to bear arms that Congress decides to arm the militia with. And the Militia Act of 1792 saw Congress mandate that the militia be armed with a single 18-gauge musket, 24-shot, and a quarter-pound of powder. Different categories that could apply to the regulating of firearms include the size, weight, and concealability of a weapon, as well as the price or economic burden of a weapon, as well as how indiscriminate the weapon is to be deployed for legitimate uses, and finally, the destructive power of the weapon. The first category that comes up is size and weight. Militia-As-Terrorism Extremists argue that anything small enough to carry by one person, any weapon that is bearable, these extremists argue the Second Amendment promises they can have one. Size can be used as a simple test to rule out some weapons that are too large. Artillery and field pieces are certainly too dangerous to allow into the hands of unregulated civilians. But bearable certainly misses a lot of small but extremely dangerous weapons. It takes 26 pounds of plutonium to achieve critical mass for a nuclear bomb. In the 1950s, the U.S. military tested the W-54, a tactical nuke that weighed 51 pounds and was designed to be man-portable. It had an explosive yield equivalent of 40,000 pounds of TNT. The W-54 can be carried by a single person. It is bearable, but it is too terrible to be allowed into the hands of an unregulated civilian militia. Bearable but terrible is a thing. Just because it is bearable doesn't mean it is protected by the Second Amendment. Size has been used as a category to regulate small, concealable arms. Most militia members during the time of the Revolutionary War carried long-barreled muskets. Black powder pistols existed at the time, but were usually not common in the militia. And so, as the Militia Acts expired, the Second Amendment slowly expanded to protect long guns, but not pistols. The idiocy that is the Heller 2008 decision ruled that people have a natural right to armed self-defense, essentially doing an end run around the Second Amendment and Constitution and legislating from the bench the notion that everyone has a right to handguns. But since it invoked a natural right to armed self-defense, Heller isn't really tied to anything specific about the Second Amendment, the Constitution, or militia service. The idiocy that is the Heller decision will take several videos to unpack. Videos 16 through 22 all cover topics related to Heller or Heller itself. It's a whole lot of stupid, and it's a whole lot of activist judges doing what activist judges do. But for this conversation, Heller deregulated the category of weapons that is handguns, but it did so without really attaching to any specific wording relating to the Second Amendment, the Constitution's militia clauses, or how militias worked. Another category that sometimes comes up is cost. Had the Militia Act of 1792 mandated every member of the militia possess an entire armory of muskets, thousands of lead shot, and hundreds of pounds of powder, the cost to maintain that would have been too great for most militia members to bear. And it likely would have been challenged and overturned. The thing today is that there is no Militia Act. There is no law that mandates everyone must possess this weapon and this many rounds of ammunition for militia service. With no Militia Act at work, Militia-As-Terrorism extremists have tried turning things upside down, arguing that if they can afford a weapon, if it is not an economic burden, then it is promised by the Second Amendment. But that too fails. In one extreme, Timothy McVeigh spent a mere $5,000 to put 7,000 pounds of explosives into a truck that obliterated a large federal building and killed 168 people. Some people might argue that they can afford spending $5,000 on a large bomb, some might argue that $5,000 is not an economic burden to them, and therefore, they argue that the Second Amendment promises them the right to possess such a weapon. A Barrett .50 caliber rifle at current prices sells for $8,000 to $10,000, and is owned by many civilians. If the threshold for what is an economic burden is set by whatever amount of money some militia-as-terrorism extremists are willing to spend to get military firepower, then that too runs into bearable but terrible results. Cost is a useless measure anyway. Molotov cocktails, glass bottles filled with gasoline designed to explode on impact, can be built for $1. And Molotov cocktails have been used as a legitimate military weapon by small units and even individual resistance fighters against enemy tanks and vehicles. So, one might argue that they are legitimate for civilian members of the militia to possess. But Molotov cocktails are categorized as a destructive device illegal to possess under federal law. The National Firearms Act of 1934 seemingly regulates many different categories of weapons: machine guns, rifles over .50 caliber, hand grenades, suppressors, sawed-off shotguns, and short-barreled rifles, among others. The categories might seem random, but the big picture is they point to weapons that have a lot of destructive capability: machine guns, large caliber rifles, or are more concealable, hand grenades, sawed-off shotguns, or aid in concealment, suppressors, and are far beyond any level of weapon that Congress would want civilian members of the militia to have. The federal assault weapons ban of 1994 had different definitions of assault weapons as it applied to rifles, shotguns, and pistols. But the big picture, again, was an attempt to regulate weapons that were too destructive for civilian members of the militia to possess. The Constitution's Militia Clause gives Congress the power to set a minimum firearm expected for militia service. The Constitution's Commerce Clause gives Congress the power to set a maximum level of weapon that will be allowed for civilian possession. This maximum could reasonably regulate weapons that show themselves to be too destructive or too concealable to allow into unregulated civilian hands. The Second Amendment mandates that all states must allow the minimum weapon mandated by Congress to be available for militia service. Between this minimum and the maximum allowed by federal law, states may choose to allow up to the federal maximum, or states may choose to regulate everything but the minimum required for militia service. The courts have repeatedly ruled that it is within Congress's powers under the Commerce Clause to regulate certain categories of weapons. And yet, despite nearly a century of precedent for the National Firearms Act regulating certain categories of weapons, every time Congress or some state attempts to regulate some other category of weapon, the Militia-As-Terrorism Extremists shout "shall not be infringed," as if the Second Amendment overrules the Constitution. When Congress considers regulating assault weapons, bump stocks, or magazine sizes, extremists scream "shall not be infringed." But it is within Congress's constitutional power to establish a maximum amount of firepower available to civilians. And it is within Congress's power to lower that limit if they choose. Now, the National Firearms Act might seem to regulate unrelated types of weapons: machine guns, hand grenades, sawed-off shotguns, and others. But those specific measures are an outcome of the requirement that laws must avoid vagueness. Laws cannot be written to outlaw "terrible" weapons, without defining at a specific physical level what exactly makes a weapons terrible. A vague law violates the Constitution's requirement for due process because people cannot tell ahead of time if the thing they possess will get them arrested. This is why the National Firearms Act covers a bunch of different weapons, but specifically defines exactly what qualifies something to fall within that law. The NFA regulates any rifle with a bore diameter over .50 caliber. The NFA regulates sawed-off shotguns with a barrel length less than 18 inches and an overall length less than 27 inches. The NFA regulates short-barreled rifles, which it defines as a rifle with a barrel length less than 16 inches and an overall length less than 26 inches. The federal assault weapons ban had three different, fairly complex definitions for what constituted an assault weapon for rifles, shotguns, and pistols, that were regulated by that law. These definitions seem to be all over the map. But they call out the specific physical details needed to satisfy the vagueness doctrine. See video number 12, Do You Mean Arbitrary? Or Vague? For a discussion of how the vagueness doctrine requires specific physical attributes to be put into law. And while the specific details of what the NFA and what the federal assault weapons ban regulated might seem to be based on categories of size, and weight, and cost, and so on, these laws have to spell out specific physical attributes to avoid being vague. But at a higher level, these laws all regulate two kinds of weapons: weapons that Congress deems too powerful for civilian possession, and weapons that are a combination of powerful and concealable. In 2017, the Las Vegas shooter used nearly 24 assault rifles and bump stocks to fire over 1,000 rounds into a crowd a quarter mile away. In 10 minutes he had killed 60 people and injured 411. In 10 minutes, one man killed 2 platoons worth of people and injured a battalion's worth of people. The Las Vegas shooting shows the damage that can occur when there is no limit to the number of firearms or ammunition a single person can possess. The Militia Selective Service Act, MSA, of 20XX is a proposed law which would re-establish a firearms minimum, similar to the single 18-gauge musket and 24-shot required by the Militia Act of 1792. MSA does not require everyone register for militia service, nor does it require everyone to possess a firearm for militia service, but MSA does establish that the minimum arm expected for militia service is a single long gun, either a .223 caliber rifle, or 20-gauge shotgun, with a barrel at least 18 inches long, an overall length at least 26 inches long, and with a mechanical loading action such as bolt action, lever action, or pump action, and a fixed internal magazine of no more than 10 rounds. MSA would also establish that the minimum ammunition expected for militia service would be 40 rounds. MSA could also add a clause that for states where handguns are legal, the minimum handgun for MSA would be a single-action revolver, with a 6-shot cylinder, and a total of 24 rounds of ammunition. This would attempt to address the nonsense that is the Heller decision which attempted to deregulate handguns in all states. If Heller is active, and a state cannot ban handguns, then MSA establishes the minimum MSA handgun for that state, a single revolver and 24 rounds of ammunition. If the insanity that is Heller is ever overturned, and states are allowed to ban handguns, then MSA would not mandate all states allow handguns. MSA only mandates a minimum handgun for states where handguns are already legal. If MSA passed at the federal level, then this would define the only arms protected by the Second Amendment. States could then choose to allow some or all other arms up to those under the federal maximums. Or states could choose to regulate and ban all other arms except the arms spelled out by MSA as expected for militia service. If a state banned all other weapons except for the single weapon specified by MSA, then someone like the Las Vegas shooter, who had dozens of weapons and thousands of rounds of ammunition, would be in violation of that state's law for possessing weapons beyond the single long gun and 40 rounds, and could be arrested before they killed anyone. MSA re-establishes minimum arms expected for militia service. That then defines the arms protected by the Second Amendment. Federal laws such as the National Firearms Act of 1934 still establish a maximum category of weapons that are allowed for civilians. States must allow arms as protected by the Second Amendment, which would be specifically defined in MSA as a single long gun. And then between that minimum that is MSA and the maximum that is the National Firearms Act, states can choose what other arms they wish to allow or regulate or ban altogether. Another important aspect of MSA is that it establishes a selective service system for possible militia service. Everyone who owns a gun must be registered with Militia Selective Service, must pass a background check. And all weapons are registered with Militia Selective Service as well. Even if a person is too old or too infirm to be drafted into the militia, their firearm might be drafted. This requires all gun buyers undergo a background check and all firearms be registered. MSA is explained in much more detail in videos 9 and 10. Video 9 explains how MSA follows in the founder's intentions for militia service and the right to bear arms. Video 10 explains how MSA would attack the iron pipeline, the biggest source of guns for criminals. MSA uses the Constitution's militia clauses to re-establish the categories of weapons that are expected for militia service: a single long gun, rifle, or shotgun, mechanical action, fixed internal magazine. And if handguns are legal in a state, then MSA defines an optional third category allowed for militia service: a single-action revolver, 6-shot, rifled barrel. The National Firearms Act of 1934 uses the Constitution's Commerce Clause to regulate quite a few categories of weapons and establishes a maximum for those categories. Congress has the power for organizing, arming, disciplining, and governing the militia. This means Congress has the power to decide what arms the militia are expected to use. And this means that Congress can establish a minimum weapon for militia use. Congress also has the power to regulate commerce, which means that Congress has the power to ban, restrict, and regulate categories of weapons outside the arms expected for militia service. And this means that Congress can establish a maximum for weapons outside militia use. If Congress cannot prohibit civilian bump stocks, then Congress cannot prohibit civilian nuclear weapons. The idea that Congress cannot regulate categories of weapons is insane. The idea that shall not be infringed overrides Congress's power to arm militias and regulate commerce is absurd. The idea that the Second Amendment promises civilians full access to all military weapons is treasonous. Treason is not the reason for the Second Amendment. Treason is not the reason for the season.